But man, going before, the Jack Tunney that we know, what can you tell us about Frank Tunney?
So the Tunneys kind of ran Toronto. I would say not all Northeast. They did not run the Maritimes, but they ran everything kind of north of Buffalo and Vermont and all of that. Whipper Billy Watson was a part of that, and Whipper Billy Watson was an NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was from Toronto, I believe, but he was a huge star in Toronto. And Frank was the promoter. Eventually, his nephew Jack took over and became the promoter and ran things in Canada. And they had quite the little fiefdom up there. For a long time, they were an NWA territory. But again, this was a place where the promoter booked a lot of the talent and booked a lot of the programs because they didn't run a whole lot, didn't have to, because it was a gold mine for them. They could run a few towns a week, and that's all they had to do. They didn't need to run a territory per se, and bring in top guys and make money. And people wanted to work there because you could go work Toronto, then you could go work Detroit, you could go work New York, and then you can make your way down to the Carolinas. It wasn't for a top guy. That was a nice run. And the Tunneys always paid well. But at the same time, that's if you were on top. The joke always used to be that by the time that I got there was that, hey, if you got your ham sandwich, which in Toronto, they always had ham sandwiches for the boys, and Fresca. And I liked Fresca, so to me, that was a good deal. My payoff, I got so they looked at it. It's funny. Jack looked at it as, hey, we're feeding the boys. Come on, nobody else is feeding the boys. We're feeding the boys. People are making fun of our ham sandwiches. I said, well, yeah, because a lot of times then you're only getting a $40 payoff. So, of course, you can feed them ham sandwiches and Frescas that you're stealing from the concession stand.
Right.
But that was the deal, man. That was the deal with Canada and with the Tunneys, was you got your ham sandwich and a Fresca. And that was a good deal. So they always had, they had access because they had access to the New York booking office. They had access to the Sheik and his guys in Detroit because it gave the guys in Detroit another place to go. And somebody's working in the Maritimes, you bring them in, and just they were able to utilize that. They only needed 4 top guys to draw. So sure, they would do it. They broke away from the NWA and eventually ended up at WWF. That was their champion, and then later on the WWF. But Jack, I think, kind of got to the point of he still ran Toronto. But Jack was getting up in age. Billy Red Lyons was somebody that helped. Great guy, Billy Red. But Billy Red helped Jack run the town. And it became, they just used WWF television, used their programs. They booked it. Jack got a percentage. Didn't have to do anything, which wasn't far from what he was doing before, because they really didn't have to do anything other than put matches on a card.
Right.
And they drew. And Toronto has always been a great wrestling town. And going back then, again, their hometown hero, Whipper Billy Watson, would make occasional appearances and would come in, and there was that belief, man, that was their guy. And you could bring in a Gene Kiniski from Vancouver, or bring him in, and like that's on the other side of the world. That's an international rivalry right there. Kaniski and Watson. It just was easy. That was an easy territory because they had so many places to draw from. And the Tunneys ran it all until, later on when Jack was ready to retire and the business just had outgrown him. And he was asked to do a lot more than what he had been doing, and decided, okay, you know what? I think I promoted my last show. I'm going to retire. And that was it. But you see, that's what happened to a lot of the territories, and a lot of the promoters were, they wanted to do things their way. And for so many years, they only did things their way for their market. And they did as little as they possibly could because it got ingrained. If you ran every Friday night, you just put an ad in the newspaper who was going to be there. And if it was hot, then people would show up. But they knew every Friday night you had a show. Every Tuesday night you had a show. And that's the way that so many different booking offices ran. Unlike, you get down south and you look at Georgia, or you look at the Carolinas and even Florida, where, man, those territories were really based on angles and issues and who's hot and what are you going to get for your money. And I'm going to start all the way down south because people always talk about Eddie Graham being one of the greatest minds and greatest bookers of all time. And I think that Eddie Graham, without a doubt, had one of the most unique and best minds for the business. Eddie Graham, look, I've heard both sides of it. Heard Eddie Graham was the guy that taught Bill Watts, how to book, that he brought Bill Watts in as booker, but it was Eddie Graham's philosophies and Eddie Graham's ideas as to why you do what you do. And we talked earlier about Dory Funk Sr. and that people, say, well, really, Eddie learned from Dory Funk Sr. How to book and the psychology of things. But Eddie ran Florida, and Eddie always ran Florida. He had bookers, and he had guys that had come in. He had Gary Hart booked for a while. He had Cowboy Bill Watts, where I think, a lot of people, including Bill, would say, man, that's where Bill really learned how to book and cut his teeth. Bill Watts is a guy booking Florida that took a heel in Dusty Rhodes and made him the American Dream. Dusty Rhodes made him the phenomenon that he became. And he did it by putting him up against, again, a foreign menace, as they would call him, Pak Song Nam from Vietnam. And Pak Song Nam was he Korean? He may have been from Korea. Pak Song was just this unstoppable force. And Pak Song and Dusty were tag team partners. And then Pak Song, Gary turned on Dusty. And that made Dusty the American Dream because he was talking about the foreign menace in Pak Song Nam. Pak Song Nam. You hear Florida. You hear America. Well, you're looking at the American Dream, and the American Dream is going to make your life a nightmare. So Bill was the guy that orchestrated all of that and put that whole thing together and really unleashed a phenomenon in the American Dream and let Dusty come out and be Dusty and be that flamboyant top babyface because people believed in Dusty. Dusty became, I'm one of the people. I'm you. When I'm in the ring, you fighting with me. Then when I throw that bionic elbow, that's your elbow inside of mine and yours and yours and yours and yours and everybody's elbow in him. Dusty fought for the people. And that was Eddie Graham, man. And that was Bill Watts and the way that they booked Florida